Do you worry that you might not be using the best or most accurate Bible translation? Or are you shopping for a new Bible and you're not sure which one to buy? What if you could make a decision without fear and just get the type of Bible that best fits your need and your budget? Well, in this video, we're going to talk about translations, and I'm going to share why I think having access to at least 3 translations will help you take some of the pressure off your decision and dispel some of that fear as well. Hi, and welcome to His Ancient Ways. If you're new here, welcome. And if you're not, well then welcome back. So I've been wanting to make this video for quite a while, but it's a deep topic that can easily take you into the weeds and get you either really confused or even sometimes mad or fearful. But it doesn't have to be that way. So I'm going to do a quick layman's explanation of why there's different translations, what it means for average Christians like you and me, what we need to be aware of, and how to use this information to navigate our translation choices with grace and ease. And if you already know a bunch of this stuff, just feel free to bounce around using the chapter breaks, which should be like down in the progress bar, but they're also listed in the description. So many educators will say, whatever translation you can read and understand is the one that you should go with. Now, while I do get that, and I wholeheartedly agree with the sentiment that you should be able to understand your translation, I still think that there's translations that aren't best for getting what most people would consider a proper rendering of the Holy Bible. So the ones that I'm thinking of here are the extreme paraphrased versions from a single author, like the Message Bible. Now, while those might have their merit and readability and even enjoyability for that matter, they're not great for deeper study dives, and they may have some doctrine infused into the translation, and that doctrine may or may not align with your beliefs or the beliefs of your church. So that being said, let's take a little closer look at the topic instead of just brushing it off by saying whatever you will read and understand is the one that you should buy. So first, I'm going to break down the different types of translations just in case, you haven't seen any of the hundreds of YouTube videos already out there on this subject. So translations are on a spectrum, which you can see here by looking at this graph. Now, keep in mind that different graphs will put certain translations kind of in different orders, but most of them will at least get the translations in the appropriate area, so it's best to use these graphs as just a general guideline. So on one side, represented on the left side of this graph, you get word-for-word translations, which are also referred to as literal translations. Now, none of these are completely 100% word-for-word into English, because that would render much of the Bible unreadable, but they're as close as they can get, for our language while maintaining understandability. Now, the main issue that people have with these translations often is that they're pretty hard to understand sometimes. Now, on the opposite side of the spectrum are the paraphrased Bibles. Now, paraphrase means to reword or to put into your own words. So these can be paraphrased by a committee or by a single author. Paraphrases are much easier to understand and read, but the main danger with these is that the single author paraphrases often are infused with the author's understanding of doctrine, and they can lose some of the beauty of recognizable Bible verses. Now, in the middle is something called dynamic equivalent, which on this graph is called thought-for-thought translations. And these are translations that are not word for word, but instead they attempt to bring readability and understanding when word for word is a little bit more confusing. Now, as you can see, each type has its merits for different uses. Word for word is best for deep Bible study. Paraphrase is best for reading or understandability, or just for the novelty of reading the Bible from a different perspective. And thought for thought is best for ease of average comprehension while sticking a little bit closer to the original intent of the Bible. So now that we have that out of the way, let's look into why some people get angry and defensive about Bible translations. From my research, it seems to have to do with a few things, which I'll break down for you really quick. And this is a very high level overview. I'm not going to get into the weeds or deep details with this information because it's really complicated and confusing. And I feel like there's other teachers that can, do that better than me. But the first issue has to do with where the source material comes from, how old it is, how many copies of text have been found to support it, and the methodology in interpreting that text. You see, there's no single complete version of original biblical text in written form anywhere. Instead, there's thousands of fragments of documents that have been found over the centuries. Now, the beauty of this is that many of the documents are copies of each other, which validates the inerrancy of the Bible, and none of them really contradict each other. But this has also resulted in different methodologies in interpreting the text. The KJV, the NKJV, and the MEV use a source and methodology that's different than all the others, and that's where the tension usually lies. The KJV only people and the never KJV people are at odds. And in my research, I actually found a never ESV guy, and I thought that was really interesting. Now, if you choose to go down the rabbit hole of this issue, you will find that there's really not as many interpretational issues as some would have you to believe. Here's the breakdown of actual differences between these translations. 75% of all the differences are not meaningful, even if the differences are viable. So let's define those words. A meaningful difference means that the text renders a different meaning altogether. Viable means that the word has a decent chance of being the original word intended by the original Holy Spirit-inspired author. So let's revisit that statistic now. 75% of differences are not meaningful, which means they don't change the meaning at all. Well, that leaves 25%. But 24% of the remaining are meaningful differences, but they're not viable. This means that even though it would change the meaning of the text, it can't possibly be the original intended meaning because the context of the passage would render it completely non-viable, meaning it would make nonsense if that were the original word. Now, I'm going to link the article that I got this information from down in the description because it's really, really interesting. I'm not necessarily endorsing this website or anything, but it's just a great resource for understanding how all of this works. But the main thing that I want to share is that this leaves only 1% of differences that are both meaningful and viable differences. And this is one of the main issues for the hyper-dogmatic translation purists. And I also want to very quickly mention one other major form of criticism is in gendering language. So many of the newer translations are changing gender wording to be more inclusive, basically for women. So they'll say, instead of saying brothers, they'll say brothers and sisters. Instead of saying sons of God, they'll say children of God instead. And of course, there's a lot more than I can talk about here, but I think you get the point. Different translations have committees that have different methodologies, and some people don't like the results of those methodologies. Now, it's my point of view, which you can agree with or not agree with, that's fine. But my point of view is as long as the Bible is Protestant and conservative, meaning it's not trying to infuse new or ungodly doctrine pertaining to the saving work of Jesus Christ on the cross, balanced with personal sanctification and holiness, then, I'm pretty much good with it. So now that we've covered the basics of translational differences, you can see why it might be helpful to use at least 3 different translations. And I'll get into that in a second. But I want to share a story with you that happened to me a couple of years ago that pertains to all of this. I was reading my New King James Bible, and I decided to look up a word in my Blue Letter Bible app, which was set to the ESV. And the passage in question was completely different, like not the same at all. In fact, I was pretty confused about it. And I do apologize. I have no idea what that passage was. I didn't write it down. I don't remember. But upon looking at my Blue Letter Bible app more closely, I saw information that said that their word study sources were different depending on what translation you were reading. It was then that I began learning about everything that I just mentioned, about different source materials and translation methodologies. But instead of getting all bent out of shape about it, I just purposed in my mind that when I'm reading the Bible, I would pay more attention to the translational footnotes that most Bibles have in the margins. And when I'm doing deeper inductive style Bible studies, I'll use a translation out of each translational camp. So I'll use the ESV and maybe sometimes the NASB, and I'll always make sure to pair it with an NKJV. that's kind of my go-to in that other camp. And then for readability, I like to use the NLT, which is New Living Translation, to more easily understand more difficult passages. The NLT uses kind of the same source materials as the NASB and the ESV, but it's kind of a borderline between thought for thought and paraphrase. It depends on what graph you're looking at to see whether or not they put it in the paraphrase or in the thought for thought. And it's a committee-based translation, which in my mind, hopefully, I have no idea if I'm right here, but hopefully in my mind, that offers more checks and balances against personally infused beliefs and doctrines that are probably more likely in a single author paraphrase. Now, sometimes I can see an infusion of interpretational doctrine in the NLT that I don't agree with, but when I'm using it, I'm either only reading and not studying, or I'm using it to bring clarity to something that I'm studying using the ESV and the NKJV. So what I do is when I find noticeable differences between the ESV and the NKJV, I will usually look in at least 3 different study aids, my ESV study Bible, and then 2 commentaries that are keyed to the NKJV. And I use word studies from both camps, which is super easy using the Blue Letter Bible app because it'll switch the interlinear word study automatically depending on the translation that you have it set to. And I will also use the NASB almost kind of like a tiebreaker because even though the ESV and the NASB both use the same source materials, they do have different translational methods. And the older NASB is probably more aligned with the KJV for translational methods, and that it's more conservative than the ESV. This kind of trio of translations will help you feel confident that you aren't missing anything and that you're understanding everything to the best of your ability. And of course, you can use one main translation as your Bible and then access the others in an app or online. Now, I know I've thrown a lot of different translations out there for you to consider, but I found another great resource for you that I'll link down in the description. It breaks down the differences between a lot of these translations, including the ones that are decidedly more Catholic instead of Protestant. And again, I'm not necessarily endorsing this website or anything. I just think that it's good, helpful information. Now, I have lots of other tips and tricks for reading and studying the Bible coming up, so make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on those. And make sure to check out the other videos on the screen for tips and tricks that I've already shared. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!